On today's episode of Tartan Talk with USA Kilts, we're talking to Peter MacDonald, tartan historian. So, Peter, welcome to the show. Thank you very much for joining us.
My pleasure.
So, you are a tartan historian. You are the lead researcher for the Scottish Tartans Authority. How long have you been a tartan historian?
Gosh, longer than I care to remember. Probably, realistically, the last 40 years.
Nice. And what drew you to that field? Give me your background story, your comic book origin story, if you will.
So my father was an anthropologist who specialised in Highland and Scottish stuff. He founded the Scottish Tartan Museum in Comrie in the 70s, and I worked there for a while with him. But if you like, I've grown up with it, always grown up with it, and it's just been the passion of my life.
So it's very interesting to hear that it was essentially a family business for you a little bit. How did you come to it? What was your career path before you got into it fully?
I was at school, so I've always had, if you like, a parallel career. At 18, I joined the army, and I served a period with the regular forces. I had always been interested in this through that period, if you like, and then left and worked with my father for about 10 or 15 years. In the museum, we travelled a lot, came to the US doing various game circuits, etc. And then I went back to the military as a reservist to start with, and then went back full-time for nearly 20 years. But at the same time carried this on, if you like, as a parallel career. So in the morning, I would start with doing research and writing. I'd then go to work all day. I'd then come home in the evening and do tartan research. And being a sad person on my holidays, I'd go and do tartan research. I finally retired in 22 and sort of been back full-time at it since then.
So when you were with your father on the Highland game circuit in the U.S., what was that like? What were you selling, or were you just giving information and that kind of thing?
No, so we did a lot of work with the then British Caledonian Airways. So they used to sponsor us to come out. We used to go and run what they called, or my father used to call a roots clinic, but we'd go out principally to Stone Mountain Games, which is probably my favourite in the US, and Grandfather Mountain. We'd have a big tent there as part of the Tartan Society, as it was then, running an information circuit, if you like, doing a series of lectures and things like that.
So which came first, your love of tartan and history and research, or the weaving?
Definitely the tartan research and the history side of it. So the weaving was if you like, a necessary function to understand some of the older textiles. So I was working with old pieces and understanding the techniques, but actually to fully understand them, I needed to learn how they were done, how they were constructed. So I taught myself to weave as part of that process, particularly things like, I don't know, we'll come on to it, herringbone salvages, offset patterns, and some of the older techniques. And it was initially a way to weave small samples in order to have access to old pieces of tartan or reconstruct older fragments, which otherwise would have been lost. So to have working examples of old patterns and techniques.
Nice. So what kind of looms did you work on? Were they all single width, like Hattersley looms, or?
Not Hattersley. So in strict terms, Hattersley is not a hand loom. So I was a hand loom weaver. I've got a four shaft single box flying shuttle loom. So a wooden loom that, everything was mechanical. As in handmade, hand thrown. So a wooden loom, what they call a flatbed four shaft. So much like you would see in a museum or something like that. That I worked on principally. I had a smaller loom as well that I would do samples on, but all completely hand woven.
So who taught you like the techniques for weaving, and or did you have to figure out historical techniques? Was there a thread of information that's traveled from, the 1700s, 1800s all the way through to today, or did you have to rediscover techniques?
I had to rediscover the techniques. I basically had to figuratively pull apart old textiles, look at how they were done, and work out how then I made them, how I managed to reconstruct them on a loom. I mean, a loom is a fairly standard or simplistic piece of kit, if you like. It's only got a few working parts. It's just the method in which you then thread it, the method in which you tie it up, etc. And that was a case of trial and error, with some discussion with the late Jamie Scarlett as well, who was a great friend and to some degree mentor in my early years, just about, which thread should you have on the engine in which order, things like that. So we had that bit of a discussion, but most of it was self-discovery.
Interesting. Were you always mechanically inclined like that? You're a multi-talented person, and in the research and your passion for it obviously comes through. But it's kind of rare that you find someone who is passionate on a intellectual level who's also very mechanically inclined with these kind of things.
Yeah, so I would say actually I'm not particularly mechanically inclined. I've changed an engine in a car, but I wouldn't ever describe myself as a car mechanic. But on something like this, it was just a case of this needed to be done. I need to learn to do it in order to understand it. So it's that way I did it. I suppose it's one of those functions that, if you need to understand something, then you have to knuckle down and learn how to do it.
So tell us about the Glen Afric project and how that kind of came to be.
It's a fantastic project, I have to say that right at the beginning. Of the things that I've been involved with in certainly the last few years, it sits right up there at the top in terms of excitement. So it came about because I was doing some work with the V&A Dundee as part of their tartan exhibition 2 years ago. And as part of the research for that, and I did a lot of the academic sort of old pieces of tartan that they were including there, they came to me for some advice. And one of the things they wanted to do was include a very early piece of tartan. They looked at a couple of pieces that you will be familiar with, like the Falkirk piece and the Chinese mummy pieces, etc., none of which were available. And they came to the Tartans Authority and said, well, do you have a sort of proto piece of tartan that we could include in the exhibition towards the beginning as part of that sort of explanation of how tartan came about? And I instantly thought of a piece that we had in our collection that, in fact, had been given to the Tartan Society back in the mid-1980s, that was found in Glen Afric during some forestry work. Fairly small piece, a piece about yay big, that had been brought in a plastic bag, given to us. And in terms of what you think of the tartan as being sort of bright and reds and greens, etc., it's relatively uninteresting to the layperson, so to speak. So it had just sat in storage case for years. And I said, well, we've got this piece, and it was an opportunity, therefore, to do some more work with it. I'd always felt the piece was older than certainly the majority of surviving pieces that I had worked with, right up to the 18th century or early 18th century. But whether that was 1690 or 690, I had no idea. So as part of that work, part of the loan process, I got my fellow trustees to agree that we would do dye analysis on it, which in effect was to tell me what I already knew, i.e. that there were no artificial dyes involved with it and that there were no imported hardwood dyes. So artificial dyes post-1856, hardwood dyes we start to see coming in from South America in the 1770s. So that gave me sort of bracket. So that the dye analysis confirmed that. What it didn't tell us is therefore how old it was. But then we had carbon-14 testing done on it, which gave us a date of, broadly speaking, the 16th century, which was phenomenal, better than I could have ever hoped. And so that gave us, if you like, the background, a storyboard behind it, which then led to some further research and indeed some ongoing research. So we're hoping now to do some isotope testing, which will allow us potentially to tell where the fleece was grown, which is really, really exciting. So there's a wonderful, if you like, backstory about this. It's a pre-Clan piece of tartan, pre-Clan Tartan piece of tartan, pre-Jacobite piece of tartan. So this is something from the reign of James IV, Mary Queen of Scots, something like that. So very, very rare, and arguably the most important piece of historical tartan surviving in Scotland.
Agreed. Now, my question is, how many other pieces of unknown, undiscovered tartans does the Scottish Tartan Authority have hidden in a filing cabinet in the back drawer?
Well, not so much in the filing cabinet, but we do have quite a number of samples, really from the early to mid 18th century, that were collected. Quite a lot of them came to us via John Telford Dunbar, who was one of the great collectors in the mid 20th century. And from him, or he gained them from ultimately Alexander Carmichael, he of the Carmida Galactica, who collected them in the US in the West, on the West Coast in the 1880s, 1890s, something like that. So we probably have perhaps 20 or 30 different patterns, unknown, unnamed, unidentified specimens from that period.
Now, going from the V&A Dundee exhibit, and all the hubbub, all the attention that was paid to the Glen Afric tartan through all that campaign and through the exhibit itself, how did we get from there to House of Edgar partnering with the STA to do the Glen Afric tartan and commercially reproduce it for today?
So there was obviously a potential commercial exploitation of this pattern as it came out. It had been unknown before. The history to it obviously made it very, very attractive. House of Edgar approached us and said, well, we're quite interested in doing something like this. And so we did, had a discussion with them about how it would be done. The most time-consuming element, if you like, was agreeing and matching the shades to something that would be suitable. So the dye analysis told us what colours were involved, i.e. red, yellow, green, and a brown stroke black. And then it was a case of me working with them to find shades of those colours that would have been appropriate to, the 1700s, 1600s, something like that. So finding something that was suitable for the period, but also then had a modern appeal. So, there's no point in doing something that, looks great if you're an academic, an archaeologist, but no one wants to buy. So there's a bit of sort of a combination of arriving at a palette that works harmoniously, if you like, that has a modern appeal as well. So that was quite a lot of the work to do that. And the other thing is that the pattern itself, or the specimen itself, is quite roughly woven. There are inconsistencies and errors in it. So I had to do quite a bit of work, if you like, to regularize and stabilize the pattern to make something that then could be woven.
I noticed that as well in the actual reproduction of it. There's a little, or in looking at the image of the original piece, it's a little irregular, but it was just slightly off of symmetrical set and all the things lining up. So I think you did a very good job in the House of Edgar did a very good job in regularizing it to make it something that would people today would expect to exist. So with the launch of the Glen Afric tartan at the trade show in January last year, how did you feel about the reception commercially of the design? Were you surprised at how far and wide the reception was, or was it something you thought was going to happen?
I wasn't surprised by, if you like, the breadth, and principally we were talking about North America. I always thought that there would be an interest there simply from other work that I have done over there. There's an appetite for some of these older patterns. What I think was most surprising was the volume, if you like, the amount. I mean, I think, and you probably know this, that within the first 2 or 3 weeks of it being launched, they had run out of the stock. And they had done, I think, a double run in expectation of that, and that went. And so they were very quickly scrabbling around, doing more dyeing in order to get the next run and indeed the next run out. So it has been enormously successful, which is very encouraging, not only in terms of if you like, how the project developed, but also the fact that there's such an interest in some of these older patterns, which is one of the things that really, really I find the most rewarding thing, is to re-establish some of these older patterns.
So after the great success, by all accounts, of the Glen Afric tartan here in the U.S. and North America in general, take us behind the scenes. Tell me how it went from the Glen Afric tartan to a whole collection of tartans about the Genesis of Tartan with House of Edgar.
So this was very much a House of Edgar initiative. I think they were very encouraged by the success of Glen Afric and quite liked the idea that there was potential for some of these older tartans to do something that hadn't been done before. And so they came to me and said, well, we're thinking that we might like to expand this repertoire, 4 or 5 patterns, half dozen patterns, something like that. And do I have some idea of some patterns that could be included? So I sat down, drew up a list of maybe a half dozen patterns actually, and then sat down with Emma at House of Edgar, and we just went through some of the ones, looked at, if you like, their history, so whether they were fitted in with the narrative, which so the basis of the Genesis collection was to have something that, as the name suggests, looks at the early tartans up to the point broadly when Clan Tartans started to develop in the 1820s, something like that. So we were looking for a number of patterns that told a story from the earliest one, Glen Afric, through to that period of about 1820. There were a number which are indeed old, but have now been adopted as Clan Tartans or are more generally associated with Clan Tartans. For example, the McDonald of Glenalladale, or some of these other patterns. So we came up with probably about 12 patterns. Then I sat down with the team at House of Edgar, and then we just knocked through the history and looked for the ones that really had an interest, a zing to them in terms of a story, because they had to have a story rather than just being a pattern. And that's what interested them, both of us. So producing things that therefore told a story, had a story in their own right.
What was the common thread? And I keep throwing at the same point of thread, so I apologize. But what was the common thread through the stories that they're trying to tell through this collection?
So I think for me, the common thread, as I say, is that, if you like, it's a continuity of development of design of history. So it's not so much that we can say here's a pattern and it gets progressively more complex as they develop, because tartan is not like that, and you get old complex ones and newer simpler ones, etc. But it was ones that we could tell, if you like, a narrative story in time. I think that was the real, genesis of this. That one that, if you like, there was a sequential historical time point that one could follow along through these patterns. And the fact that they had nice stories that you could hang on these individual time frames just helped, if you like, sell the story of the project as a whole and give you some nice benchmarks of history.
Yeah, as a lover of a good story myself, I love that you can kind of put these almost in sequential order and tell an important story about the tartan, about tartan itself and or Scotland through cloth. It's a neat and interesting way to do something.
Yeah, and what it does is particularly tell, as I say, you've got that pre-Jacobite, pre-Clan Tartan period with the Glen Afric, and then you start to see the influence, particularly in the 18th century, of the Jacobites and how tartan becomes inextricably linked with them through that period, and some important markers in time and individuals through that process. So right up through to then the Highland revival. So you've got, if you like, the true story, in the nicest possible way, the reinvented or reimagined story right at the end of the project.
Yeah, and it's a story that that hasn't really been told before or told in this way.
No. There's only, in terms of the way this is being done, there's only, I think, really been one attempt to do this before, and that was D.C. Stewart's Old and Rare Scottish Tartans. Wonderful book, published in 1893. As the name suggests, it was old and rare tartans, and he tried to put them in a sequential order, which I guess was something that we were trying to follow as a concept. D.C. Stewart got some things horribly wrong, and he got some of the things out of context, etc. But in doing this project, we, in essence, it's a bit of a homage to that idea. And certainly in terms of a commercial production, this is the first time anything like that has been attempted.
So it's the first time that as a larger scale project, something like this has been attempted. Was there ever any individual times or projects that you've been involved in where you've recreated a particular tartan for a museum? Or I know like the Loch Heron, you just did a piece of them, an old Grant tartan for the Chief of Clan Grant. Tell me about other times where something similar to this maybe was a one-off thing that you had done.
So a lot of the work that I've done in the past with mills, or indeed my own hand weaving, has concentrated on individual reconstructions of a piece for a particular project. So you mentioned Grant 1714. That was one. I've done a reconstruction of a piece of McDonald from about 1820. In the past, I've rewoven the McDonald of Glenalladale. I was probably the first person to do that. So a number of these individual projects. Where this differs is that it is a project to produce a range of stock tartans that are therefore available and will be available more widely and for a longer period. Because all the things I've done in the past have been effectively bespoke short runs, and once they're gone, generally they're gone. So
how important is it to you from a for lack of a term or lack of a phrase, a legacy standpoint, to partner with somebody like House of Edgar who has the ability to scale things where you as a single individual only have one loom and only so much time in the day?
Well, I think it's hugely important. And one of the reasons is that they can take the risk. I mean, it is a risk. They take that commercial risk, if you like. When I do a project and I have to fund the whole thing, it's a personal risk, but therefore I'm only doing a relatively short run and I'm only doing one at a time. But here we can provide, for want of a better word, a tartan portfolio, a breadth of things which some of them I would have never done on my own, because I probably wouldn't have had the wherewithal to do the marketing to promote some of the patterns that we'll talk about in a minute. So I think that's what's really exciting, is bringing to the fore tartans that probably would have never been woven.
Out of the dozens or so, we kind of touched on this a little bit earlier, but out of the dozen or so tartans that you put forward, were there any that you were really, really fighting for, or how did the process go between you and Emma? Was it fully collaborative, or were there sparks involved?
We don't have sparks. There were never sparks, but we had some. There were certainly others I might have wanted to put in, and for understandable reasons, particularly where they had a more identifiable clan attribution, i.e. they've been adopted more recently and used by a clan. They might still be old and they might have a nice story to them, but they felt that probably was not something they wanted to do, because in many ways that sort of restricts them a little bit, rather than being an unattributed tartan or principally unattributed tartans. So we had a sort of a to and fro. There were one or two in there which just sold themselves. I mean, Glen Afric obviously being at the front, and the fact that we'd already done that was there. That was, if you like to use a military term, that was the left of arc, and we'd already worked that one out. And then it was a case of just talking through which ones, and also looking at patterns that were visually different from each other. So you might have had two that had brilliant stories, but there could only be one, a bit like Highlander. So you then work out, well, which is it and why this one, and so that's how we arrived at 6 tartans that are visually quite different, but all have their own narratives that will stand in their own right and have something about them that will make them hopefully attractive and intriguing.
Now, the one that immediately stood out to me, and I remember speaking to Simon about this, months and months before he told me that you guys were doing this whole project, was the Culloden tartan. I actually approached them and said, like, hey, I'd like to do a run of the Culloden tartan, a historically accurate representation. And that's kind of where he said, that may be already kind of on the table with something we're doing. I made it very uncomfortable for him, as I do. So that is mine. Tell me a bit about your journey with the Culloden tartan and the Culloden coat, if you will.
Right, so the Culloden tartan is one of probably the best known tartans in terms of, if you like, popularist, not just for clan use, etc., and particularly because of its use by Highland dancers in the past, etc. When I talk about the Culloden coat tartan, I am, of course, talking about the slightly revolting purple goldy tartan, which is very much in your face. It's one of those that comes from D.W. Stewart's 1893 Alden Rare. That's a book I've loved all my life, is to pour through it in terms of a quality or production of book, to actually to have one that has these silk samples that you can touch and pour over. It's absolutely fabulous. But I had always felt that the coloration of that is wrong. Never, ever, in all the specimens I've looked at from the 18th and early 19th century, have I ever seen an original piece that has that shade of gold and purple. It just seemed completely wrong. And I had always hypothesized that it was probably green and blue, yucky green and blue, whatever. And I had spent a long time trying to work out where the coat had gone. So I sort of knew who had the coat when D.C. Stewart copied it. And I had worked out who had owned it before. So that was William Skeat Cumming, who'd owned it before him, and indeed who'd owned it before him. So I could trace the coat back to about 1860, something like that. What I couldn't do was work out who'd had it before then, nor could I happen to work out what happened to it from about 1900. It just disappeared. And I was in the Kelvingrove Museum in Glasgow one day, and I walked down, I think it's on the second floor, down to their tartan hall, for want of a better word. And out of the corner of my eye, I saw this coat, and I thought, I know what that is. Immediately, I recognised it from the, figuratively, the other side of the room. And I said, you do know what you've got here, don't you? Because they just had, a tartan coat, blah, blah. I said to me, no, this is, and I instantly recognised it for what it was. I was not in the least surprised to find out that it was blue and green. It was one of those slightly frustrating things, museums being what they are. They couldn't tell me because of data protection who had donated it. So I know that it had been donated in about 1990 by someone who'd had it, I think, for quite a long time. But beyond that, they didn't know. But Kelvingrove were very good at then allowing me access to look at the coat inside out, to match the shades, and more importantly, to take the thread count from detailed photographs. And what that showed me was not only was D.C. Stewart's coloration wrong, but actually the setting of his coat was wrong as well. Proportionally, there were errors in it. So I was able to correct those.
So where do you think, obviously we're hypothesizing, I'm assuming you'd never met Mr. Stewart, but where do you think he came up with this almost fanciful purple and gold kind of coloration? I could see maybe the olive green, like the olive drabby green kind of color being confused for a gold, but the purple, it seems pretty far off from what the jacket actually looks like.
Absolutely. So, truthfully, yes, I've never met him because he moved to Australia in about 1900 and died there. So, no, I was fortunate to meet his son in the 70s, but that's another story. So the thing about Alden Rare is, right at the preamble, he says that it is an accurate reconstruction of all the tartans. So he had them dyed and hand woven so that they matched exactly the original pieces, until you start looking at the original pieces. And I did a piece of work to look at all the tartans in his book and go back and find the original specimens that he based them on. So it's not just the Culloden tartan, or the Culloden coat tartan, but, for example, the plaid from Culloden that he also has in there, which is effectively a section of the Moy Hall plaid. That also in his book is yellow, a sort of mid-blue, and a scarlet red. And it's another one of those, when you see the original, it's nothing like. How did he get it so wrong? I think he was colourblind. I can't prove it, but I also think both he and his son were colourblind, actually. And so I think that he took colours, did some sort of matching, and then went back to the dyes and said, this is the colour to match. Because if he'd given it to anybody else, or anybody else had had access to any of these for a long time, they would have known that they weren't a good colour match. So that's the only way only rationale, if you like, I can think that that's how he got it so wrong.
Interesting. So of the collection, which one is your personal favorite? You've mentioned the Moy Hall tartan, you mentioned Culloden tartan. Which one is your personal favorite?
Gosh, that's put me on the spot. I think so. We've got 6 patterns, and I am, intimately familiar with all of them. I think, in terms of producing this collection, the one that was the biggest challenge and, in many ways, the most exciting is the Archer's tartan. And I say that because it's the earliest uniform tartan, but more importantly, it's hugely complex. When you see the original coats, they're incredibly complex. When I think about having to weave those, it's sort of bulks. The challenge of taking that very, very busy pattern and fitting it into a modern loom was really quite substantial. And initially I gave Emma the thread counts, and she came out to me and said, "We can't weave this." And I said, "Well, oh yes, you can. Let me." And we sat down and we went through the whole thread count and did some adjustments to make it fit their loom. But it was really quite a challenge. And that's probably the tartan that would have never been woven but for this project, because I can't see anybody wanting to have that just as an individual, and therefore will have commissioned it. Now it's out there, I can see quite a lot, well, it will be out there. I can see a real interest in this because, again, you've got a very early tartan that you can identify to a group, to a place, to a time. So in terms of this collection, for me, it's the most exciting one. And I guess because also it's the one, although I had done some research on the uniform of the Company of Archers, it's not one that I had ever had a crack at weaving, or probably would have woven myself, whereas all the others I have had a crack at weaving myself as well.
So with the Royal Company, or with the Company of Archers tartan, what was it's interesting you say that there was some pushback on the feasibility of having a particular tartan woven. What was, I know that over like 8 colors becomes an issue for certain looms, for certain mills. What was the issue with that one?
The number of threads in the repeat that were required, it was actually the warping and everything else that they just didn't have the capacity to warp that number of threads in the right order across the web to do it correctly. They just couldn't work out how to do it. And so we had to do, and this is a technique you learn when you're working with old textiles, and you certainly look at Wilson's records, etc., that some people think that there is one thread count for a tartan, full stop, and there's not. And so if you look at, say, Wilson's 1819 key pattern book, there are 6 thread counts for Macduff, and proportionally they differ. So for them, you could make the red and the green bigger or smaller, as long as you kept either what we would call the ground colours, as long as you kept the finer lines still in broadly the same size, then you make a closer pattern or a more open pattern, but you still have the same pattern. Because sometimes people think, oh, you need to, if you like, halve or double all of the colours at the same proportion. Well, you don't, and you can still get the same effect. So it was working with Emma and the team there to explain how you could make adjustments to some of the sizes of some of the ground areas that visually it wouldn't make a difference, but actually it would then fit the warping process. So, whether something is 20 threads or 18 threads, you won't see the difference from 2 feet away, but actually it might mean it fits when you then multiply that out. So it was that process. And for them understanding that it was all right to do that, and there was historical precedent for doing things like this. So in that particular case, I think actually it was the people probably Wilson's, but the red was a very popular colour, as you know, and particularly in the 19th century, very much a popular colour for fashion. And they worked out that actually you could just take the pattern, make it bigger, put in more red, and it becomes more red than what's not to like. And so they went about it that way. But I think that was a deliberate act to make it a redder tartan, rather than saying, how are we going to fit this? Because if you'd done that, you would have probably just, expanded the green area as well. So you'd have kept the proportions. But if you think of, and I'm using my hands a lot, I know, but if you think of the Prince Charles Edward, and you've got a red area and a green area, what they've done in the Royal Stuarts then make that bit much, much bigger, but kept the green area proportionally the same. So you, rather than make them both the same size and making a larger set.
So why is it important for new life to be breathed into historical tartans?
old tartans are our history. They're, if you like, our lifeblood. They're where modern trade came from. But if you lose, like language or anything else, if you lose your past, you lose part of your history. And retaining these old patterns, bringing them back to life, giving them life, is a way of preserving the past for future generations. And for me, there's an intrinsic beauty in so many of these older patterns that I just felt was something that we shouldn't lose in the rush for modernity. Yeah, there are new tartans every week, but we shouldn't lose sight of the old ones just because we want something new. And quite often, more often than not, actually, these old tartans just have a beauty in if you like, the complexity, the way the colours are put together, etc. That is just a bit like the natural, like the golden mean, has a natural affinity to the eye that one instantly feels very comfortable with, and it's something that we should be preserving, promoting, and sharing for others to appreciate.
So, along with obviously older tartans, you also kind of were very, I won't say adamant, but I know that you were pushing for the herringbone salvage. So, talk to me a little bit about the herringbone salvage that's part of this collection for the single width cloth, as well as the historical precedent and how it kind of came about.
So, herringbone salvage, and for your viewers, I don't know whether you've got a piece, but I've got a piece here, and I don't know whether this will show, but let's just try. But I don't know whether you can see up here. But on the end here, on where my fingers are, if I've got the light, herringbone salvage, generally a piece at the edge of a cloth. So when you weave cloth, you're weaving it long ways, and on one side you would have what would then become the selvage, at the bottom, the herringbone. Herringbone is not only decorative, it provides a form of overlocking, a slightly tougher edge. It was a technique commonly found in the 18th century on pieces of pladding, i.e. cloth that was made to be joined and used broad, rather than cloth that was necessarily woven to make clothing and be cut up, for example, because then you end up with a piece of zigzag that's running through it. So technically, you've got the last inch and a half, something like that, of a zigzag pattern, and that's done so you have all the threads running, if you like, all the threads running in one direction, right the way across, if you like, the warp, and then you start to have this alternating zigzag pattern just at the edge there. There was a traditional way of doing it. More often than not, it was a navy blue band with a little bit of red just at the end. What I found fascinating is when you look at old specimens from across the country, that same style seems to have been the most commonly adapted or adopted. I have no idea how people learned to do that. Where did they learn that was the way to do it? That's what we don't know. But a herringbone selvage is something I've used in my work for many years now. In some of my specials that I've done with Lochcarron and some of the other weavers, I've used it. And I said to Emma that it would be great, what do they think about using herringbones in the single width, which they thought was a fantastic idea. We then talked about and did some trials. Because the cloth is a medium weight, it's finer than I traditionally work with. It was then working on a side of herringbone that worked for that cloth. And so we did a series of tests to take the same number of threads and then work out whether we want I think it was 8 bands of herringbone or 4 or 5 bands. We just did some trial and error and work on that till we arrived at something that worked. And again, you end up with, on the single width, a decorative band along the bottom. Sometimes it will follow the pattern naturally. More often than not, it doesn't. It becomes what's called a selvage pattern or selvage mark, depending on whether it's solid or part of the tartan, along the bottom. So we then worked out how to place that in relation to the pattern as a whole. Because traditionally, when you did it, a weaver would have a pivot on one of the selvages, and that's the selvage that will be then joined. And then you work the pattern across, and then you work out the selvage mark, the herringboning on the other side. So in order for the single width cloth to do that, we started, if you like, the reverse way around. We started with the salvage mark, worked out what would look good there in relation to the pattern, and then worked the pattern out the other side. And what happens on the other edge, which is a lino edge, is not really important, because it may work out naturally, but it may not. But that's not the point. The point was to get the salvage mark and the herringboning in the right position relative to the pattern.
It's interesting you phrase it that way. I never thought about it. Talking about the top edge of the kilt, understood when you're making a traditional, no, I shouldn't say traditional, when you're making a contemporary today tailored 8-yard kilt, obviously the top just gets cut off and you don't really worry about it. You worry about the bottom edge. But it's interesting that you say that, the weavers would start with essentially the one bottom edge and work out the pivot there so that they could splice it and then be a bit, what's the word I'm looking for? But, not waste a whole lot of cloth for the overlap for that pivot to keep the pattern going across. That's interesting, because when I use single width cloth today to make like a fly plate from House of Edgar or something like that, what ends up happening is I end up usually having to overlap 4 or 5 inches, or I have to do a different kind of hem just to, hide the stitching and hide it and lock it in. But if they had just put the pivot right on the edge, boop, I only have to overlap, a half inch.
But that requires the cloth to be, or the pattern to be offset. And that means, so when modern cloth is woven today, generally, you start with the middle of the pattern a pivot in the middle of the pattern, and then you work out so that both sides are the same, which is fine because you can use it for all sorts of things. Quite often in a kilt and kilting, you end up with the salvage, which is quite unattractive. And you see, a white line on the bottom or the yellow on the bottom, or just because they haven't done their sums. Whereas with traditional weaving, if that's the width of your warp, you would then offset the pattern so that you have a pivot on the edge, and you'd work out which, there are always 2 pivots, which of those you'd want. Doesn't work with asymmetric tartans, but let's leave those. So you end up with that. You've got the pivot, sorry, you've got the joining part there and the other joining part there. So you weave your length, you then turn and join it. And so the salvage marks of the salvage, which was on here, and the herringboning, then ends up on both sides. And then when you turn the cloth and wear it, you've got a salvage at the bottom and a herringbone there. So but there's a real ingenuity to not only working out how to set that pattern, but offsetting it. And every time I have done this with a commercial weaver, I have had to do the calculations for them, because it's just an historic thing that they don't do and they don't use. And it was fine for this project because, as I say, it wasn't essential to have the pivot on the other side. But if you are, then you have to start doing all sorts of weird and wonderful calculations to make it fit.
I do find it very interesting how it's a technique that's essentially been lost because in favor of other techniques, and that are the mills interested in reinvigorating it across other things, or it's just like, nah, cool, we'll do it for the historical stuff, but that's not what people want in an everyday normal tartan.
Gosh, I'm not sure I can speak for them, but I'll have a go. I think generally they are more about, in the broader sense, mass production, so the broadest utility for a piece of cloth, and therefore something which has a less broad utility, they'll probably shy away from, because you end up with stuff on the shelf potentially, you can't sell it quite as widely. There's also much more work, as I say, because every individual pattern then has to be reworked if you wanted to have that herringbone salvage. So I think there's less of an interest in that, and certainly there's no interest in doing the historical stuff with a salvage, herringbone on one side and a pivot on the other, because you'd already have to start changing the width of your cloth and all sorts of strange things as well. So I think it's, is it demand led or is it production driven? I think it's probably production driven to some degree, and also the fact that modernity, like so many things, has meant that we have just, if you like, bred out certain of these techniques in terms of mass production and mass favour. If you want it hand woven, you can have anything you want, but something like this, all these techniques will be gone. I guess the thing that is the greatest fear, certainly for me as a traditionalist, is that over time, with the introduction of the faster looms and the tuck edge, not a salvage, we will lose the ability to do things like a herringbone salvage because of the way that it's constructed. And I could see perhaps in 20, 30, 40, 50 years' time that we will not have looms that will do a salvage any longer. And there's a thing to think about. So you will lose all the ability to do something like that.
It's interesting to have almost a Darwinian thought process on it as you do, talking about how it's being bred out over time and where things, kind of give way to speed and efficiency. It's an interesting, sad but interesting way to kind of look at it.
Yeah. And I'll give you another example. So Wilsons of Bannockburn in the early 1900s were incorporating silk in some of their stripes. So white, yellow, sometimes pale blue, they would put silk through. And because they didn't finish their cloth in the way that modern cloth is finished, they could do that. I've had one weaver try to do that in the last 40 years. And because they put it through a finishing process, the cloth ends up like that because the wool shrinks and the silk doesn't. So again, that's something that if there were an interest in doing, I've hand woven it, and you can do that because you take it off the loom and the cloth's finished. But that's, again, something else that we have effectively bred out. Yeah,
that's interesting as well. Yeah, the finishing process on the whole, and things shrinking at different rates. I didn't think about that, but that makes a lot of sense. So back to the collection at hand here. How difficult was it to find modern dyes that were accurate representations, or what was the process like in trying to make sure that the dyes that you guys were using and House of Edgar was using were as accurate to the original pieces as possible?
So in terms of modern dyeing, I guess anything is possible. It's just a case of how precise one wants to be. Modern dyeing, there's quite a complexity. So any color that you think is fairly simple. It's not a case of just opening the box that says red and pouring it in. Red might have bits of green in it, bits of blue in it, or whatever. What one does is you work out the RGB value, if you like, or the Pantone shade for the colors that you want to replicate. So the first thing we did was sit down with historic specimens and match them as closely as possible with color cards, get an RGB value, go to the dyers and then say, right, this is the color we want, give us 3 examples, one in the middle and 2 either side, if you like, and we'll just sit down in natural light, preferably using them against the original specimens and working out the best match we've got. It will always be slightly different because artificial dyes will always look slightly different from natural dyes. The yarn fiber and the way it's finished will also make it look slightly different than an 18th century specimen, for example. Plus that 18th century specimen will have probably degraded in some degree. So you're always working at a compromise, but trying to reach something that sits within the broad hue tone value of the original. So it's a case of trial and error, having first, if you like, come up with a reasonably good stab at what the color code should be. How,
in this particular case, was there one shade or one tartan that gave you and or House of Edgar more problems than another, or one that you were just like, it was more of a passion of you wanted to be dead on exactly accurate for a particular one?
Well, that's probably a question best to address to House of Edgar, but certainly from my experience and the bits we went through, I think the one that was probably the greatest amount of time, because it was non-standard, was the Glen Afric, because we were sitting there working with, to all intents and purposes, non-standard colours, stroke shades, compared with modern tartans. So working out, a shade of red that would work for a natural dye. So I sat down with natural dye specimens that I had done from the past, and we went through all of those and worked out, a suitable red that worked with a suitable off-shade color of, yellow, ochre, or whatever. So that was probably the most challenging. I think for the others, some of them, they had something that would work pretty closely from stock. Others, I think there was a couple of the reds in the archers and a couple of the others that needed to be special dye. So again, it's just that process of going through to the dyers, and I think Emma she was probably not their favourite person when she'd go back and get it. Yeah, it's good, but it's not quite good enough, and can you re-show? So it's a long process. The one that was perhaps also, if you like, outside the box was the last one in the collection because it had brown in it. And brown, you don't get a lot of tartans before the advent of hunting tartans that have brown in it. So it was historically unusual, and getting a suitable shade of brown, because it's slightly different from, if you like, stock browns that we have today, was again just dyeing something that worked for that.
And that's the Wilsons of Bannockburn unnamed tartan?
Yeah, so it's that's the one that Wilsons were producing. It had several names in some of the sample books. So there are 3 surviving specimens, I know of that, all of which have some sort of attribution to either Culloden or Prince Charles Edward Stuart, said to be from a coat that he wore during the 45. There is a coat in the National Museum of Scotland's collection, but that is absolutely Wilson's cloth. The coat is said to be from the 45, but it's not because it has silk in it. It's definitely Wilson's cloth. But I wonder whether they copied it from an older piece that has subsequently disappeared. That's what we don't know. But in terms of an unnamed tartan, this is right at the end of the, if you like, the Highland revival before the advent of Clan Tartans, and showed the popularity not only of some of these fancy tartans, as they called them, but also new colours coming in. Brown was a very popular colour, certainly in the 1820s, 1830s, very much a fashion colour. And you would get people writing to Wilson saying, well, can we have, this tartan you sent us last time, but could you put brown in it because it's very popular this year? And so, it's a nice nuanced piece to, if you like, bridge the old to the new being everything that came after 1820, 1822.
So aside from the Culloden coat and your discovery, if you will, at the Kelvingrove Museum, what other research project have you done that you're most proud of, and why?
I think the Glenalladale tartan comes to mind. So what's called the McDonald of Glenalladale. Maybe 20 years ago, someone sent me a photograph of a piece. The mills have been producing something they call McDonald of Glenalladale since the 60s. Someone sent me a photograph of a piece that I instantly recognized. This was from Canada. And I instantly recognized it as what is woven as Glenalladale. But again, I had always felt that was incorrectly woven. The sample, or the photograph of the sample that was sent to me, confirmed that, particularly that it was or should have been a symmetrical rather than asymmetrical tartan. And then within probably 2 weeks, I got contacted by a museum on the other side of Prince Edward Island and said, oh, we've got this piece of cloth that has this story to it. And it was quite clearly a larger piece of the same plaid. So this was a plaid taken to Nova Scotia, Prince Edward Isle in 1772, 73, something like that, by John McDonald of Glenalladale. When he emigrated, said to have been worn by his father at Culloden. I did a lot of work to reconstruct it, establish the pattern, reconstruct it from the surviving specimens. And then 2 years ago, just 19, I think it was, for the 175th, I think it was, 200th anniversary of the Glenalladale settlers going out to Prince Edward Island. I was out there and was able to actually see the original piece myself and confirm all the research that I'd done in 20 years and the extrapolations I'd done and reconstruction I'd done was correct to what I'd done. So I guess that story, knowing where it came from, the McDonalds of Glenalladale were part of the McDonalds of Clanranald, which is my own branch. So it was quite a bit of personal journey, if you like, in doing that as well. So a really interesting story. But that's just one of them. There are so many pieces that I've done, I guess, in the past. That's the one that immediately comes to mind. And then, of course, there's my Tartan Holy Grail, which is to try and find a piece of the original Black Watch tartan. So I've calculated that between 1739 when the regiment was formed, and the end of the American War of Independence, something like 40 miles of that tartan was woven. A lot of the Black Watch, Fraser Highlanders, etc., remained in North America. Not one piece of tartan, of Black Watch tartan, is known to exist before 1795. And I find it impossible that of that 40 odd miles, there's not a fragment, probably in North America somewhere, that is absolutely my tartan holy grail to try and find.
So you're going to retire and then fly across to the States and just travel around the country searching for pieces of the original Black Watch tartan.
That would be nice. I have retired, but yeah, no, that would be great. I was in, as I say, Prince Edward Island a couple of years ago. Did some interviews with CBC, Canadian Broadcasting, CBS, trying to find it. You know, a number of people picked it up and came back to me, but everything they had was much more recent, perhaps unsurprisingly. And I'm just doing some correspondence with a guy who's part of the Scots who settled in Quebec in the 18th century there to see if putting a request out in French in the Quebecois area might elicit something as well. But I'm sure either in Canada or, northern US, there might be a specimen there somewhere in, Mrs. McClumpher's chest or something, not realizing what they've got. And these pieces do come up from time to time. I was looking at a piece now in the National Museum just 2 weeks ago that had been donated, that was said to have been worn at Culloden, said to have bullet holes in it, which it doesn't, but that's another story. So I'm doing a paper on that at the moment. But again, these pieces come up on a fairly regular basis, that pieces that we've never seen before. So there are still new pieces being turned up through research. Quite a lot of them in private collections, but surprisingly, some in museums, like the Culloden coats, which they didn't know what they'd got.
So many historians kind of look back through the time period that they're studying and have a moment, the white whale, if you will, of something that they want to travel back and see, or they want to ask why a particular thing was done, because it's just lost to history, lost to time. What is the one thing, if you could narrow it down to one, that you would love to either travel back in time and witness or get an answer to the question of why?
I think it would probably get in my time machine and travel back probably to about 1740, and then hang around for the next, let's say, 10 years, and travel the Highlands and understand how tartan was used at the time, the breadth, the style of tartans, how frequently it was worn, what types of pattern were worn, etc. Because everything we have, we're trying to work out from fragments of history, and quite often misreporting, and then you get the whole prescription era, which, contrary to the very commonly cited myth, didn't ban tartan, but did ban Highland clothes for men. But we have nothing was really written down prior to that, and so we've got a yawning gap. And to be able to step back in time and see it, take my camera with me as well, of course, to record it, would just be fantastic.
You may have a difficult time plugging it in or developing the film at that point, but but I agree 100%. I would love to go back and just see how it was actually done, and how people used it in their daily lives, and if they put as much meaning into the cloth as we do today.
Mm-hmm. Yep. I suspect not. It was a fabric. It certainly wouldn't have been, depending what period, when you went back, how far you went back, it wouldn't have been as universal as I think people might like to think. And also, I think there would have been a much greater range of types of tartan. The ones that we don't see, as with other clothing, common people's clothing. Very little of that survives. And even something like the Glen Afric, which is now very brown, etc., or very yellow and red, would have been a status piece at that time. It's very finely woven, very beautifully spun, etc. That's not a common person's piece of clothing.
Another great one would be is if we could travel back, let's say to Wilsons or another mill at the time, and either take one of their old pattern books with us, or go through their records and see how and why they created tartans, and and sold them, and the commerce and the trade at the time, and how things evolved through that?
Oh, and in terms of Wilsons, we almost don't have to do that because we have their key pattern book. We have something like 20,000 letters of correspondence that survive from Wilsons that are in museums, in collections. The thing we haven't done is transcribe them all. But there are bills of lading, there are discussions and purchase orders for dye stuffs, for wool, so all of the things, and also letters of correspondence with people designing tartans or them designing tartans for people. Lovely little snippets. So there's one I know from, I guess, about 1820, 1815, something like that. A merchant writing to Wilsons and saying, can you send me X yards of Ross tartan? And if you haven't got any, send me something else and call it Ross, which is just such a wonderful, explanation or understanding of how the concept of Clan Tartans was beginning at that point. So I've got to have some Ross tartan, and but the punter at the other end doesn't know if it's not Ross, so just give me one and I'll call it Ross. And you start to see this development of the concept at the time.
It's good to see that unethical business practice existed way back then as well as today. It's not just a new phenomenon.
No.
So if you could change one thing about how tartan is either researched or preserved on a social, cultural level, what would that be?
I'll give you a 2-point answer to that. So the first would be for me and others who are, have a level of knowledge to be able to get into universities, colleges, etc., that teach textiles. Because certainly here at the moment, you've got a 2-3 year degree, textile college degree, where then there's no element of traditional tartan in there. And I get it that people are saying, well, what's the point of all this traditional stuff? Well, go and ask Alexander McQueen or various other people why they use tartan. And so understanding how patterns are put together, actually transcends history. It uses history for the future. And if you like, a prime example of that would be the work I did with Chanel last year, where I produced a new design based on some of their jewelry patterns for last year, but using traditional colours and patterns, etc. So there's a modern application for tartan. The other thing that personally I would love to do is to write a new book based on my 40 years of research. If you like, the best book historical book on tartans is Telford Dunbar's History of Highland Dress, published in 1960. So all the research was done 10 years before that. We now know so much more and have access to far better photography, etc. That as a teaching aid for future generations is really where I think we should be looking at. Social media is very transitory, but I'd like something that is much more academic, that is widely available and reachable and approachable for people.
Do you think there's obviously there's a lot of misinformation out on social media as well, but do you think that there's a place for the academic within the sphere, within the realm of social media, to be able to make it more tangible to everyday people who just have an interest in a thing, who aren't going to go to the level of going through all of the research and all of the accompanying work that goes along with it?
There are, and Facebook is a great one, obviously Instagram and some of the others. Personally, I like Facebook because it gives you the space that if you've done your prep beforehand and put it in a format, I can do, if you like, a teaching piece that just explains about pivots or colours versus shades. So those sort of things, just to help people understand so that they come to something with their eyes open rather than wearing blinkers. Because you'll have seen it, and I certainly see it all the time. People talk about, oh, well, we've got this tartan and then a very nice, bright one. And you say to them, it's the same thing. And people cannot understand or see it. Very easy to produce a graphic where you can got the 5 main colorways all running sequentially into each other. You can make all the lines line up, etc. They go, oh, I get it now. Or explaining to them what a pivot is, how it works, those sort of things. So yeah, there is absolutely a place for using social media as a way of exciting people. So I do posts all the time where I just put in little snippets of some of my research. Or here's a kilt I've been looking at from 1806, or look at this rosette and how it was done, or look at the ties on this kilt. And it just makes people also then think and understand that there are other ways of doing things, that it's not just, a square box. It has different sides, different ways of looking at it. Helps them open their mind to different possibilities.
And I know you've been very active in social media, and I'll broaden the term to forums. Like I know you have been on X marks the spot forever and a day. So you've been doing your part, if I want to phrase it that way, to educating people on a very, very entry level understanding of particular things, all the way up to a very academic way of understanding things as well.
Yeah. As I say, it's really important. And there is, on any social media, you'll get the people right from, I know nothing or very little, right to people who you can have a really interesting discussion and they will challenge you, which is really good, because the only way that we take things forward, certainly in terms of research, is to be challenged. So someone will say to you, well, what about, and how do you know that? And you go, well, that's a really good point. Let me show you how I know that. Or, oh, I'm not sure, I'll go and check. So having that level of interaction is, in many ways, it's brilliant, because you have potentially the world there to interact with and discuss and develop and share ideas, etc. So really, really good. So that is one way of passing things on. Unfortunately, it is very, if you like, segmented. And so, today we might be talking about kilt ribbons, and tomorrow we might be talking about silk dye. There's no natural progression or join as you would have in an academic course or something like that. So there's a place for both, absolutely. But if we can excite people to bring them in and want to learn more, then we've done our job to some degree.
Are you familiar with the Living Treasures program in Japan, where they use apprenticeships to kind of preserve traditional crafts?
I am because I've met one. Years ago now, I had a Japanese weaver who was a weaver of obi. So obi are the traditional belts that you wear with a kimono. And this guy, all he did was weave the belts. Came over to see me with a Japanese film crew, and we had a long discussion about the traditions and the fact that he was a living treasure, that we don't have something similar here, not just for weaving, but for other traditional crafts as well. And it was very emotive, because he ended up in tears. I mean, this guy was probably in his 80s, and he just felt so sad that we didn't have a similar thing in this country to preserve a lot of these traditions. I'm actually talking to some people, if you like, tangentially at the moment, about how to capture some of my knowledge and learning and pass it on to future generations, because I am very conscious that there is no new me, no next me. I knew D.C. Stewart, I knew Telford Dunbar, Jamie Scarlett, etc. Learned from all of these people, and there is no one that has the same level of interest, certainly over here, probably more so in the US actually. But it is crucial to pass on this information, which is why I write down all of my stuff and self-publish, so that it's available for others. Yeah. But there's nothing like actually being able to pass it on, one-to-one.
Have you considered a video series where you can literally just kind of talk to the camera, as opposed to just writing things down, but that as well as recording yourself talking about the different things, and you can show examples and whatnot?
I have. I guess it's just I'm not a very good self-publicist, and I think you need to be to do things like that, or you need someone to come and badger you, and it's not happened at the moment. There's too much else going on, but it's certainly something that we're exploring at the moment, about how to preserve and pass on some of this stuff. Yeah.
Peter, is there anything else you want to talk about, or are there any other things we touched on that we want to go a little bit deeper on?
In your question set, you had asked about, is this the first time that people had tried to do reconstructions? And I think, there's a point in saying that, if you like, this has always been going on. Wilsons of Bannockburn, whilst they had, stocked arts, for want of a better word, they were also doing specials for people. So I've seen a piece with a herringbone salvage done by Wilsons, which was not a standard for them. So they were clearly doing commissions to reconstruct old pieces. At the time, we know, for example, the Moy Hall plaid There were 2 attempts to reconstruct it in probably 1820, 1823, and about 1830, where people were trying to recreate old patterns. So we see that. I've also got a kilt that was made in probably about 1920, but I know the cloth was woven in 1908, and it was woven by the Leeds Textile College at the behest of a Scottish sculptor by the name of Pittenjean McGillivray, who was attempting to recreate 18th century style cloth in terms of quality and colour, etc. So that's always been going on, and I guess my own research and weaving carried that on as well, but on a small scale. So it just talks again to that point that as far as the Genesis collection is concerned, it's the first time that we've gone down the, if you like, the commercial route of trying to do something like this and make it more widely available.
So do you have any other projects coming up or anything you want to, hint at coming down the pike in the future?
I'm trying to think there. So there are a couple of things that I'm doing at the moment, but as I say, these are, if you like, slow burn projects based on some sort of deeper research. I've got one of the things I'd like to do is I've certainly been through all of D.W. Stewart's work. So old and rare. I've been, as I say, through all of that. I have written a complete treatise looking at all the pieces that he reproduced and going back and finding the original specimens and discussing each of them in turn, where he got it right or mostly where he got it wrong. What to do with that? Again, it's something I'm now onto about 100 pages with all photographs of the original pieces, blah, 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 blah. That's a sort of an ongoing piece. I've also been working at trying to track down every extant example of a piece of Wilson's cloth that's a different pattern. So how many of their patterns that we know about? So the 1819 key pattern book had 100 name patterns plus about 200 number patterns, trying to find as many of those that survive, which I think is really important because this is the beginning of tartan as we know it. So just doing that sort of work, and again getting into some of the older collections. I've looked at the catalogues for the Great Exhibition in 1896, 1908, 1910, and they all reference pieces that were loaned at the time. And you sort of say, I wonder what happened to that piece, because that coat, that plaid, that kilt seems to have disappeared. So trying to track down some of these. So I guess that's really where some of my deeper research, ongoing research is at the moment. And to get back to the US, I would love to come back and do some lectures, US or something like that. I was at the New Hampshire Games a couple of years ago, which was really, really good. Did a series of lectures there. So I'd love to get back to Stone Mountain and a couple of the other places, just to share, to see who, within the US particularly, is interested in taking up some of this research and helping out with it in a more active way. Because as I say, I'm very conscious that, when I get run over by a bus, a lot of that goes, and it's very important to pass this on more widely.
Well, let's hope, A, you don't get run over from a bus, or if you do, it's a long time from now.
Not today.
And B, if you come to the US, we would love to have you in the studio to do a proper sit-down interview. Sure.
Yeah, that'd be good.
So where, if people want to look you up online, how do they get in contact with you? What's your website?
Websites, www.scottishtartans.co.uk. And you'll also find me on Instagram under Tartan Historian.
So Peter, thank you for taking the time to speak with us today. Your work that you've done to preserve tartans for future generations is invaluable, and I appreciate you very much, my friend.
My pleasure. You can see it's getting darker as we've talked. It's getting darker and darker. But it's been a great pleasure talking to you, Rocky.
You as well.
I hope you found this interview educational. Peter McDonald is a fountain of knowledge, and I, for one, am very glad that he shares all that knowledge with the community. If you want to see the tartans that we were talking about in this video, the link is going to be down in the description. And if you want other content like this, I would love it if you would subscribe to the channel.